Hello, my fellow unicorns. Today I'm going to read the second to last story of Terrifying Tales to Tell at Night. This next story is called The Man Who Drew Cats by Michael Marshall Smith. Tom was a very tall man. So tall, he didn't even have a nickname for it. Ned Black, who was at least a head shorter, had been Tower Block since the 6th grade, and Jack had a sign up over the door saying, "Mind your head, Ned." But Tom was just Tom. It was like he was so tall, it didn't bear mentioning even for a joke. Be a bit like ragging someone for breathing. Of course, there were other reasons, too, for not ragging Tom about his height or anything else. The guys you'll find perched on stools around Jack's bar watching the game and buying beers, they've known each other forever. Gone to Miss Stadler's school together, gotten under each other's mom's feet, double dated right up to giving each other's best man speech. Kingstown is a small place, you understand, and the old boys who come regular to Jack's mostly spent their childhoods in the same treehouse. Of course, they'd since gone their separate ways, up to a point. Pete was an accountant, now, had a small office down Union Street, just off the square, and did pretty good, whereas Ned was still pumping gas and changing oil, and after 40 years, he did that pretty good too. Comes a time when men have known each other so long, they forget what they do for a living most of the time, because it just don't matter. When you talk, there's a little bit of skimming stones down the quarry in the 2nd grade, a whisper of dolling up to go to that first dance, a tad of going to the housewarming when they moved 10 years back. There's all that, so much more than you can say, and none of it's important, except for having happened. So we'll stop by and have a couple of beers and talk about the town and rag each other, and the pleasures just in shooting the breeze, and it don't really matter what's said, just the fact that we're all still here to say it. But Tom, he was different. We all remember the first time we saw him. It was a long, hot summer, like we haven't seen in the 10 years since, and we were lolling under the fans at Jack's and complaining about the tourists. Kingstown does get its share in the summer, even though it's not near the sea and we don't have a McDonald's, and I'll be damned if I can figure out why folk will go out of their way to see what's just a quiet little town near some mountains. It was as hot as hell that afternoon, and as much as a man could do to sit in his shirt sleeves and drink the coolest beer he could find. And Jack's is the coolest for us, and always will be, I guess. Then Tom walked in. His hair was already pretty white back then, and long, and his face was brown and tough, with gray eyes like diamonds set in leather. He was dressed mainly in black, with that long coat that made you hot just to look at it, but he looked comfortable, like he carried his very own weather around with him and he was just fine. He got a beer and sat down at a table and read the Town Bugle, and that was that. It was special because there wasn't anything special about it. Jack's bar isn't exactly exclusive, and we don't all turn around and stare at anyone new if they come in, but that place is like the monument to shared times. If a tourist couple comes in out of the heat and sits down, nobody says anything, and maybe nobody even notices the front of their mind, but it's like there's a little island of the alien in the water, and the currents don't just ebb and flow the way they usually do, if you get what I mean. Tom just walked in and sat down, and it was all right because he was just there just like we were, and could have been for 30 years. He sat and read his paper like part of the same river, and everyone just carried on downstream the way they were. Pretty soon he goes up for another beer, and a few of us got to talking to him. We got his name and what he did, painting, he said. And after that, it was just about shooting the breeze. That quick. He came in that summer afternoon and just fell into the conversation like he'd been there all his life. And sometimes it was hard to imagine he hadn't been. Nobody knew where he came from or where he'd been, and there was something real quiet about him, a stillness, a man in a slightly different world. But he showed enough to get along real well with us, and a bunch of old friends don't often let someone in like that. Anyway, he stayed that whole summer, rented himself a place just around the corner from the square, or so he said. I never saw it. I guess no one did. He was a private man, private like a steel door with 4 bars and a couple of 6-inch padlocks. And when he left the square at the end of the day, he could have vanished as soon as he turned the corner for all we knew. But he always came from that direction in the morning, with his easel on his back and paint box under his arm. And he always wore that black coat like it was part of him. He always looked cool. And the funny thing was, when you stood near him, you could swear you felt cool yourself. I remember Pete saying over a beer that it wouldn't surprise him none if, assuming it ever rained again, Tom would walk around in his own column of dryness. He was just joking, of course, but Tom made you think things like that. Jack's bar looks right out into the square, the kind of square towns don't have much anymore, big and dusty with old roads out each corner, tall shops and houses on all the sides, and some stone paving in the middle of a fountain that ain't worked in a living memory. Well, in the summer, the old square is just full of out-of-towners in pink toweling jumpsuits and nasty jackets standing around saying wow and taking pictures of our quaint old hall and our quaint old stores and even our quaint old selves if we stand still too long. Tom would sit out near the fountain and paint, and those people would stand and watch for hours. But he didn't paint the houses or the square or the old picture house. He painted animals, and painted them like you've never seen. Birds with huge blue speckled wings, and cats with cutting green eyes, and whatever he painted, it looked like it was just coiled up on the canvas, ready to fly away. He didn't do them in their normal colors. They were all reds and purples and deep blues and greens, and yet they fair sparkled with life. It was a wonder to watch. He'd put up a fresh paper, sit looking at nothing in particular, then dip his brush in his paint and draw a line, maybe red, maybe blue. Then he had another, maybe the same color, maybe not. Stroke by stroke, you could see the animal build up in front of your eyes, and yet, when it was finished, you couldn't believe it hadn't always been there. When he finished, he'd spray it with some stuff to fix the paints, and put the price on it, and you can believe me, those paintings were sold before they hit the ground. Spreading businessmen from New Jersey, or some such, and their bored wives would always come alive for maybe the first time in years, and walk away with one of those paintings and their arms around each other, looking like they found a bit of something they'd forgotten they'd lost. Come about 6 o'clock, Tom would finish up and walk across to Jack's, looking like a sailing ship among rowing boats, and saying yes, he'd be back again tomorrow, and yes, he'd be happy to do a painting for them. He'd get a beer and sit with us and watch the game, and there'd be no paint on his fingers or his clothes. Not a spot. I figured he'd gotten so much control over that paint, it went where it was told and nowhere else. I asked him once how he could bear to let those paintings go. I know if I'd been able to make anything that good in my whole life, I couldn't let it out of my sight. I want to keep it to look at it sometimes. He thought for a moment, and then he said he believed it depends on how much of yourself you put into it. If you've gone deep down and pulled what's inside and put it down, then you don't want to let that go. You want to keep it, so you can check sometimes that it's still safely tied down. Comes a time when a painting's so right and so good that it's private, and no one will understand it except the man who put it down. Only he is going to know what he's talking about. But the everyday paintings, well, they were mainly just because he liked to paint animals, and he liked for people to have them. He could only put a piece of himself into something that he was going to sell, but they paid for the beers, and I guess it's like they fellows in Jack's bar. If you like talking, you don't always have to say something important. Why animals? Well, if you've seen him with them, I guess you wouldn't have to ask. He loved them, is all, and they loved him right back. The cats were always his favorites. My old pa used to say that cats weren't nothing but sleeping machines put on earth to do some of the human sleeping for them. And whenever Tom worked in the square, there always be a couple curled up near his feet. And whenever he did a chalk drawing, he'd always do a cat. Once in a while, you see, Tom seemed to get tired of painting on paper, and he'd get some chalks and sit down on the baking flagstones and just do a drawing right there on the dusty rock. Now, I've told you about his paintings, but these drawings were something else again. It was like, because they couldn't be bought, but would be washed away, he was putting some more of himself into it, doing more than just shooting the breeze. They were just chalk on dusty stone, and they were still in these weird colors, but I tell you, children wouldn't walk near them, because they looked so real. And they weren't the only ones either. People would stand a few feet back and stare, and you could see the wonder in their eyes. If they could have been bought, there were people who would have sold their houses, I'm telling you. And it's a funny thing, because a couple of times when I walked over to open the store up in the mornings, I saw a dead bird or two on top of those drawings, almost like they had landed on it and had been so terrified to find themselves right on top of a cat, they dropped dead of fright. But they must have been dumped there by some real cat, of course, because some of those birds look like they've been mauled a bit. I used to throw them in the bushes to tidy up, and some of them were pretty broken up. Old Tom was a godsend to a lot of mothers that summer, who found they could leave their little ones by him, do their shopping in peace, and have soda with their friends, and come back to find the kids still sitting quietly, watching Tom paint. He didn't mind them at all, and would talk to them and make them laugh, and kids of that age laughing is one of the best sounds there is. It's the kind of sound that makes the trees grow. They're young and curious, and the world spins around them, and when they laugh, the world seems a brighter place, because it takes you back to a time when you knew no evil, and everything was good, or if it wasn't, it would be over by tomorrow. And here, I guess I finally come down to it, because there was this one little boy who didn't laugh much, but just sat quiet and watchful, and I guess he probably understands more of what happened that summer than any of us, though maybe not in words he could tell. His name was Billy McNeil, and he was Jim Valentine's kid. Jim used to be a mechanic, worked with Ned up at the gas station, and raced beat-up cars after hours, which is why this kid was called McNeil now. One Sunday, Jim took a corner a mite too fast, and the car rolled and the gas tank caught, and they never did find all the wheels. A year later, his Mary married again. God only knows why, her folks warned her, friends warned her, but I guess love must have been blind. Sam McNeil's work schedule was at best pretty empty, and mostly he just drank and hung out with friends who maybe weren't always on his side of the law. I guess Mary had her own sad little miracle and got her sight back pretty soon, because it wasn't long before Sam got free with his fists when the evenings got too long, and he'd had a lot too many. He didn't see Mary around much anymore. In these parts, people tend to stare at black eyes on a woman, and a deaf man could hear the whisperings of, "We told her so." One morning, Tom was sitting painting as usual, and little Billy was sitting watching him. Usually, he just wandered off after a while, but this morning Mary was at the doctor's, and she had come over to collect him, walking quickly with her face lowered, but not low enough. I was watching from the store. It was kind of a slow day. Tom's face never showed much. He was a man for a quiet smile and a raised eyebrow, but he looked shocked that morning. Mary's eyes were puffed and purple, and there was a cut on her cheek an inch long. I guess we sort of gotten used to seeing her like that, and if the truth be known, some of the wives thought she got remarried a bit on the soon side, and I suppose we may all have been a bit cold toward her, Jim Valentine having been so well liked and all. Tom looked from the little boy who never laughed much, to his mom with her tired, unhappy eyes and her beat-up face, and his own face went from shocked to stony, and I can't describe it any other way, but I felt a cold chill cross my heart from right across the square. But then he smiled and ruffled Billy's hair, and Mary took Billy's hand and they went off. They turned back once, and Tom was still looking after them. And he gave Billy a little wave, and he waved back, and mother and child smiled together. That night in Jack's, Tom put a quiet question about Mary, and we told him the story. As he listened, his face seemed to harden from within, his eyes growing flat and dead. We told him that old Lula Chance, who lived next door to the McNeils, said that sometimes you could hear him shouting and her pleading till 3 a.m, and on still nights the sound of Billy crying for even longer than that. Told him it was a shame, but what could you do? Folks keep themselves out of each other's faces around here, and I guess Sam and his drinking buddies didn't have much to fear from nearly retireders like us anyhow. Told him it was a terrible thing, and none of us liked it. But these things happened, and what could you do? Tom listened and didn't say a word. He just sat there in his black coat and listened to us pass the buck. After a while the talk sort of petered out, and we all sat and watched the bubbles in our beers. I guess the bottom line was that none of us really thought about it much, except as another chapter of small-town gossip. And did I feel shamed by that time we'd finished telling it? Sitting there with Tom was no laughs at all. He had a real edge to him, and seemed more unknown than known that night. He stared at his laced fingers for a long time. Then he began, real slow, to talk. He'd been married once, he said, a long time ago, and he lived in a place called Stevensburg with his wife Rachel. When he talked about her, the air seemed to go softer, and we all sat quiet and supped our beers and remembered how it had been way back when we first loved our own wives. He talked of her smile and the look in her eyes, and when we went home that night, I guess there were a few wives who were surprised at how tight they got hugged, and who went to sleep in their husband's arms feeling more loved and contented than they had in a long while. He'd loved her, and she him for a few years. They were the happiest couple on earth. Then, a third party had got involved. Tom didn't say his name, and he spoke real neutrally about him. But it was a gentleness, like silk wrapped around a knife. Anyway, his wife fell in love with him, or thought she had. As Tom spoke these words, some of us looked up at him startled, like we'd been slapped across the face. Rachel did what so many do and lived to regret till their dying day. She was so mixed up and getting so much pressure from the other guy that she decided to plow on with one mistake and make it the biggest in the world. She left Tom. He talked with her, pleaded even. It was almost impossible to imagine Tom ever doing that, but I guess the man we knew was a different guy from the one he was remembering. The pleading made no difference, and so Tom had to carry on living in Stevensburg, walking the same tracks, seeing them around, wondering if she was as free and easy with him, if the light in her eyes was shining on him now. And each time the man saw Tom, he'd look straight at him and crease a little smile, a grin that said he knew about the pleading, and he and his cronies had a good laugh. And yes, I'm going home with your wife tonight, and you want to compare notes. And then he turned and kissed Rachel on the mouth, his eyes on Tom, smiling. And she let him do it. He had kept gossiping old women in stories for weeks, the way Tom kept losing weight, and his temper, and the will to live. He took 3 months of it, and then left without bothering to sell the house. Stevensburg was where he'd grown up, and courted and loved, and now, wherever he turned, the good times had rotted, and hung like fly-blown corpses in all the cherished places. He'd never been back. It took an hour to tell, and then he stopped talking, and Pete got all of us some more beers. We were sitting sad and thoughtful, tired like we lived it ourselves, and I guess most of us had some little bit of it, but had we ever loved anyone the way he had loved her? I doubt it. Not all of us put together. Pete set the beers down, and Ned asked Tom why he hadn't just beaten the living hell out of the guy. Now, no one else would have actually asked that, but Ned's a good guy, and I guess we were all with him in feeling a piece of that oldest and most crushing hatred in the world, the hate of a man who's lost the woman he loves to another, and we knew what Ned was saying. I'm not saying it's a good thing, and I know you're not supposed to feel like that these days, but show me a man who says he doesn't, and I'll show you a liar. Love's the only feeling worth a tin nickel, but you've got to know that it comes from both sides of a man's character, and the deeper it runs, the darker the pool it draws from. My guess is he just hated the man too much to hit him. Comes a time when that isn't enough, when nothing is ever going to be enough, and so you can't do anything at all. And as he talked, the pain just flowed out like a river that wasn't ever going to be stopped. A river that had just cut a channel through every corner of his soul. I learned something that night, that you can go your whole life without realizing that there are things that can be done that can mess someone up so badly for so long that they just cannot be allowed. And there are some kinds of pain that you cannot suffer to be brought into the world. And then Tom was done telling, and he raised a smile and said that in the end, he hadn't done anything to the man except paint him a picture, which I didn't understand. But Tom looked like he talked all he was going to. So we got some more beers and shot some quiet pool before going home, but I guess we all knew what he'd been talking about. Billy McNeil was just a child. He should have been dancing through a world like a big fun fair full of sunlight and sounds, and instead he went home at night and saw his mom being beaten up by a man with a crap for brains who struck out at a good woman because he was too stupid to deal with the world. Most kids go to sleep thinking about bikes and climbing apple trees and skimming stones, and he was lying there, hearing the shouting and things breaking, and his mother quietly sobbing when it was over. Tom didn't say any of that, but he did, and we knew he was right. The summer kept up bright and hot, and we all had our businesses to attend to. Jack sold a lot of beer, and I sold a lot of ice cream. Sorry, ma'am, just 3 flavors, and no, bubblegum pistachio ain't one of them. And Ned fixed the whole bunch of cracked radiators. Tom sat right out there in the square, with a couple of cats by his feet, and a crowd around him, magicking up animals in the sun. And I think that after that night, Mary maybe got a few more smiles as she did her shopping, and maybe a few more wives stopped to talk to her. She looked a lot better, too. Sam had a job by the sound of it, and her face healed up pretty soon. You could often see her standing holding Billy's hand as they watched Tom paint for a while before they went home. I think she realized they had a friend in him. Sometimes Billy was there all afternoon, and he was happy there in the sun by Tom's feet, and oftentimes he'd pick up a piece of chalk and sit scrawling on the pavement. Sometimes I'd see Tom lean over and say something to him, and he'd look up and smile a simple child smile that beamed in the sunlight. The tourists kept coming, and the sun kept shining, and it was one of those summers that go on forever and stick in a child's mind and tell you what summer should be like for the rest of your life. And I'm damn sure it sticks in Billy's mind, just like it does in all of ours. Because one morning, Mary didn't come into the store, which had gotten to be an irregular sort of thing, and Billy wasn't out there in the square. After the way the things had been the last few weeks, that could only be bad news. So I left the boy, John, in charge of the store, and hurried over to have a word with Tom. I was kind of worried. I was no more than halfway across to him when I saw Billy come running from the opposite corner of the square, going straight to Tom. He was crying fit to burst, and just leapt up at Tom and clung to him, his arms wrapped tight around his neck. Then his mother came from the same direction, running as best she could. She got to Tom, and they just looked at each other. Mary's a real pretty girl, but you wouldn't have believed it then. It looked like he'd actually broken her nose this time, and blood was streaming out of her lip. She started sobbing, saying Sam had just lost his job because he was back on the drink, and what could she do? And then suddenly there was a roar, and I was shoved aside, and Sam was standing there, still wearing his slippers, weaving back and forth, and radiating that aura of violence that keeps men like him safe. He started shouting at Mary to take the kid back home, and she just flinched and cowered closer to Tom like she was huddling around a fire to keep out the cold. This just got Sam even wilder, and he staggered forward and told Tom to get out of it if he knew what was good for him, and grabbed Mary's arm and tried to yank her toward him, his face terrible with rage. When Tom stood up, now Tom was a tall man, but he wasn't a young man, and he was thin. Sam was 30 and built like the town hall. When he did work, it usually involved moving heavy things from one place to another, and his strength was supercharged by a whole pile of drunken nastiness. But at that moment the crowd stepped back as one, and I suddenly felt very afraid for Sam McNeil. Tom looked like you could take anything you cared to him and it would just break, like he was a huge spike of granite wrapped in skin, with 2 holes in the face where the rock showed through. And he was mad. Not hot and mind-blowing like Sam, but mad and cold. There was a long pause, then Sam weaved back a step and shouted, "You just come on home, you hear? Gonna be real trouble if you don't, Mary. Real trouble." and then he stormed off across the square the way he came, knocking his way through the tourist vultures, soaking up the spicy local color. Mary turned to Tom, so afraid at her to see. Instead, she guessed she better get going. Tom looked at her for a moment and then spoke for the first time. Do you love him? Even if you wanted to, you ain't going to lie to eyes like that, for fear something inside you will break. Real quiet, she said, no, and began crying softly as she took Billy's hand and walked slowly back across the square. Tom packed up his stuff and walked over to Jack's. I went with him and had a beer, but I had to get back to the shop, and Tom just sat there like a trigger, silent and strung up tight as a drum. Somewhere down near the bottom of those still waters, something was stirring, something I thought I didn't want to see. About an hour later, it was lunchtime, and I just left the shop to have a break when suddenly something whacked into the back of my legs and nearly knocked me down. It was Billy. And he had a bruise around his eye that was already closing it up. I knew what the only thing to do was, and I did it. I took his hand and led him across to Jack's bar, feeling a hard anger pushing against my throat. When he saw Tom, Billy ran to him again, and Tom looked him in his arms and looked over Billy's shoulder at me, and I felt my old anger collapse utterly in the face of a fury I could never have generated. I tried to find a word to describe it, but they all just seemed like they were in the wrong language. All I can say is I wanted to be somewhere else, and it felt real cold standing there facing that stranger in a black coat. Then the moment passed, and Tom was holding the kid close, ruffling his hair and talking to him in a low voice, murmuring the words I thought only mothers knew. He dried Billy's tears and checked his eye. Then he got off his stool, smiled down at him, and said, I think it's time we did some drawing. What do you say? And taking the kid's hand, he picked up his chalk box and walked out into the square. I don't know how many times I looked up and watched them that afternoon. They were sitting side by side on the stone, Billy's little hand wrapped around one of Tom's fingers, and Tom doing one of his chalk drawings. Every now and then, Billy would reach across and add a little bit, and Tom would smile and say something, and Billy's gurgling laugh would float across the square. The store was real busy that afternoon, and I was chained to that counter, but I could tell by the size of the crowd that a lot of Tom was going into that picture, and maybe a little bit of Billy too. It was about 4 o'clock before I could take a break. I walked across the crowded square in the mid-afternoon heat and shouldered my way through to where they sat with a couple of cold cokes. And when I saw it, my mouth just dropped open and took a 5-minute vacation while I tried to take it in. It was a cat, all right, but not a normal cat. It was a life-size tiger. I'd never seen Tom do anything near that big before, and as I stood there in the beating sun trying to get my mind around it, it almost seemed to stand in 3 dimensions. A nearly living thing. Its stomach was very lean and thin. Its tail seemed to twitch with color, and as Tom worked on the eyes and jaws, his face set with a rigid concentration, quite unlike his usual calming painting face. The snarling mask of the tiger came to life before my eyes. All I could see that he wasn't just putting a bit of himself in at all. This was a man at full stretch, giving all of himself and reaching down for more, pulling up bloody fistfuls and throwing them down. The tiger was all the rage I'd seen in his eyes, and more, and like his love for Rachel, that rage just seemed bigger than any other man could comprehend. He was pouring it out and sculpting it into the lean and ravenous creature coming to pulsating life in front of us on the pavement, and the weird purples and blues and reds just made it seem more vibrant and alive. I watched him working furiously on it, the boys sometimes helping, adding a tiny bit here and there that strangely seemed to add to it, and thought I understood what he meant that evening a few weeks back. He said he'd done a painting for the man who'd given him so much pain. Then, as now, he must have found what I guess you'd call something fancy like catharsis through his skills with chalks. He had wrenched the brain up from within him and nailed it down onto something solid that he could walk away from. Now he was helping that little boy do the same, and the boy did look better, his bruised eye hardly showing with the wide smile on his face as he watched the big cat conjured up from nowhere in front of him. We all just stood and watched, like something out of an old story, the simple folk and the magical stranger. It always feels like you're giving a bit of yourself away when you praise someone else's creation, and it's often done grudgingly, but you could feel the awe that day like a warm wind. Comes a time when you realize something special is happening, something you're never going to see again, and there isn't anything you can do but watch. Well, I had to go back to the store after a while. I hated to go, but, well, John is a good boy, married now, of course, but in those days his head was full of girls, and it didn't do to leave him alone in a busy shop for too long. So, the long hot day drew slowly to a close. I kept the store open till late, when the light began to turn, and the square emptied out with all the tourists were going away to write postcards and see if we didn't have even just a little McDonald's hidden away someplace. I suppose Mary had troubles enough at home, realized where the boy would be, and figured he was safer there than anywhere else. And I guess she was right. Tom and Billy finished up the drawing, and then Tom sat and talked to him for some time. Then they got up and the kid walked slowly off to the corner of the square, looking back to wave at Tom a couple of times. Tom stood and watched him go, and when Billy had gone, he stayed there for a while, head down, like a huge black statue in the gathering dark. He looked kind of creepy out there, and I don't mind telling you I was glad when he finally moved and started walking over towards Jack's. I ran out to catch up with him and drew level just as we passed the drawing, and then I had to stop. I couldn't just look at that and move at the same time. Finished, the drawing was like nothing on earth, and I suppose that's exactly what it was. I can't hope to describe it to you, although I've seen it in my dreams many times in the last 10 years. He had to be there on that heavy summer night, had to know what was going on. Otherwise, it was going to sound like it was just a drawing. That tiger was out, and out terrifying. It looked so mean and hungry. I don't know what, it just looked like the darkest parts of mankind. The pain and the fury and the vengeful hate nailed down in front of you for you to see, and I just stood there and shivered in the humid evening air. "We did him a picture," Tom said quietly. "Yeah," I said, and nodded. Like I said, I know what catharsis means, and I thought I understood what he was saying, but I really didn't want to look at him much longer. "Let's go have a beer, eh?" The storm in Tom hadn't passed. I could tell, and he still seemed to thrum with crackling emotions, looking for an earth, but I thought the clouds might be breaking, and I was glad. And so we walked slowly over to Jack's, and had a few beers and watched some pool being played. Tom seemed pretty tired, but still alert, and I relaxed a little. Come 11, most of the guys started going on their way, and I was surprised to see Tom get another beer. Pete, Ned, and I stayed on, and Jack, of course, though we knew our loving wives would have something to say about that. It just didn't seem time to go. Outside, it had gotten pretty dark, though the moon was keeping the square in a kind of twilight, and the lights in the bar threw a pool of warmth out of the front window. Then, about 12 o'clock, it happened, and I don't suppose any of us will ever see the same world we grew up in again. I've told this whole thing like it was just me who was there, but we all were, and we remember it together. Because suddenly, there was a wailing sound outside, a thin, cutting cry getting closer. Tom immediately snapped to his feet and stared out the window like he'd been waiting for it. And we looked out across the square, and we saw little Billy come running, and we could see the blood on his face from there. Some of us got to get up, but Tom snarled at us to stay there, and so I guess we just stayed put, sitting back down like we'd been pushed. He strode out the door into the square, and the boy saw him and ran to him, and Tom folded him in his cloak and held him close and warm. But he didn't come back in. He just stood there, and he was waiting for something. Now there's a lot of crap talked about silences. I've read novels when I have the time and you see things like time stood still and so on, and you think, no way it did. So I'll just say, I don't think anyone in the world breathed in the next minute. There was no wind, no movement. The stillness and silence were like you could touch them, but more than that, they were like, that's all there was, and all there had ever been. We felt the slow red throb of violence from right across the square before we could even see the man. Then Sam came staggering into view, waving a bottle like a flag and cursing his head off. At first he couldn't see Tom and the boy because they were on the opposite side of the fountain, and he ground to a wavering halt. But then he started shouting, rough jags of sound that seemed to strike against the silence and die instead of breaking it. And he began charging across the square, and if ever there was a man with murder in his thoughts, then it was Sam McNeil. He was like a man who'd given his soul to the evening off. I wanted to shout to Tom to get the hell out of the way, to come inside, but the words wouldn't come out of my throat, and we all just stood there, knuckles whitening as we clutched the bar and stared, our mouths open like we made a pact never to use them again. Tom just stood there, watching Sam come forward to him, getting closer, almost as far as the spot where Tom usually painted. It felt like we were looking out of the window at a picture of something that happened long ago in another place and time, and the closer Sam got, the more I began to feel very afraid for him. It was at that moment that Sam stopped dead in his tracks, skidding forward like in some kid's cartoon, his shout dying off in his ragged throat. He was staring at the ground in front of him, his eyes wide and his mouth a stupid circle. Then he began to scream. It was a high, shrill noise like a woman's, and coming out of that bull of a man, it sent fear racking down my spine. He started making thrashing movements like he was trying to move backward, but he just stayed where he was. His movements became unmistakable. At about the same time his screams turned from terror to agony. He was trying to get his leg away from something. Suddenly, he seemed to fall forward on one knee, with his other leg stuck out behind him, and he raised his head and shrieked at the dark skies, and we saw his face then, and I'm not going to forget that face so long as I live. It was a face from before there were any words, the face behind our oldest fears and earliest nightmares. The face we're terrified of seeing on ourselves one night when we're alone in the dark, and it finally comes out from under the bed to get us, like we always knew it would. Then Sam fell on his face, his leg buckled up, and he still thrashed and screamed and clawed at the ground with his hands, blood running from his broken fingernails as he twitched and struggled. Maybe the light was playing tricks, and my eyes were sparkling anyway on account of being too paralyzed with fear to even blink. But as he thrashed less and less, it became harder and harder to see him at all, and as the breeze whipped up stronger, his screams began to sound a lot like the wind. But he still writhed and moaned, and then suddenly there was the most god-awful crunching sound, and then there was no movement or sound anymore, like they were on a string of heads all turned together, and we saw Tom still standing there, his coat flapping in the wind. He had a hand on Billy's shoulder, and as we looked we could see that Mary was there too now, and he had one arm round her as she sobbed into his coat. I don't know how long we just sat there staring, but then we were ejected off our seats and out of the bar. Pete and Ned ran to Tom, but Jack and I went down to where Sam had fallen, and we stared down, and I tell you, the rest of my life now seems like a build-up to and a climb down from that moment. We were standing in front of a chalk drawing of a tiger. Even now my scalp seems to tighten when I think of it, and my chest feels like someone punched a hole in it and tipped a gallon of ice water inside. I'll just tell you the facts. Jack was there, and he knows what we saw and what we didn't see. What we didn't see was Sam McNeil. He just wasn't there. We saw a drawing of a tiger in purples and greens, a little bit scuffed, and there was a lot more red round the mouth of that tiger than there had been that afternoon. And I'm sure that if either of us could have dreamed of reaching out and touching it, it would have been warm too. And the hardest part to tell is this. I'd seen that drawing in the afternoon, and Jack had too, and we knew that when it was done, it was lean and thin. I swear to God, that tiger wasn't thin anymore. What Jack and I were looking at was one fat tiger. After a while I looked up and across at Tom. He was still standing with Mary and Billy, but they weren't crying anymore. Mary was hugging Billy so tight he squawked, and Tom's face looked calm and alive and creased with a smile. And as we stood there, the skies opened up for the first time in months, and a cool rain hammered down. At my feet, colors began to run, and lines became less distinct. Jack and I stood and watched till there was just pools of meaningless colors, and then we walked slowly over to the others, not even looking at the bottle lying on the ground, and we all stayed there a long time in the rain, facing each other, not saying a word. Well, that was 10 years ago, near enough. After a while, Mary took Billy home, and they turned to give us a little wave before they turned the corner. The cuts on Billy's face healed real quick, and he's a good-looking boy now. He looks a lot like his dad, and he's already fooling about in cars. Helps me in the store sometimes. His mom ain't aged a day and looks wonderful. She never married again, but she looks real happy the way she is. The rest of us just said a simple goodnight. Goodnight was all we could muster, and maybe that's all there was to say. Then we walked off home in the direction of our wives. Tom gave me a small smile before he turned and walked off alone. I almost followed him. I wanted to say something, but in the end I just stayed where I was and watched him go. And that's how I'll always remember him best, because for a moment there was a spark in his eyes, and I knew that some pain had been lifted deep down inside somewhere. Then he walked, and no one has seen him since. And like I said, it's been about 10 years now. He wasn't there in the square the next morning, and he didn't come in for a beer. Like he'd never been. He just wasn't there, except for the hole in our hearts. It's funny how much you can miss a quiet man. We're all still here, of course. Jack, Ned, Pete, and the boys, not all much the same, though even older and grayer. Pete lost his wife, and Ned retired, but things go on the same. The tourists come in the summer, and we sit on the stools and drink our cold beers and shoot the breeze about ball games and families and how the world's going to crap. And sometimes we'll draw close and talk about a night a long time ago, and about paintings and cats, and about the quietest man we never knew, wondering where he is and what he's doing. And we've had a 6-pack of beer in the back of the fridge for 10 years now, and the minute he walks through that door and pulls up a stool, that's his. So that was a really great story. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Stay tuned for my next and final terrifying tales to tell at night. And after this, I'm probably going to move on to telling some creepypastas. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Good night.